People laughed the first time they saw the roof. Not because it was ugly, because it looked unfinished. Elias Mercer had spent nearly 2 months cutting timber, hauling beams, and shaping every part of his cabin by hand. People expected walls rising high toward a normal roofline like every other home in the valley. Instead, they watched him build something that looked almost buried before winter even arrived. The roof stretched nearly to the ground on both sides. Long, steep, so low along the edges a man could touch it without lifting his arm. From a distance, the cabin looked more like a giant wooden wedge pressed into the snow than a proper house. Jonas Hale rode past one afternoon and pulled his horse to a stop. He stared at it for several seconds, then laughed. "Mercer," he called, "you building yourself a house or a pile of firewood?" Several men traveling behind him laughed too. Elias stood balanced on a ladder fastening cedar planks into place. "House," he answered simply. Jonas looked again. "You forgot the walls." More laughter, because from the road, that actually looked true. Most cabins in the valley had tall, straight walls with peaked roofs sitting high above them. Elias's cabin barely had visible walls at all. The roof dominated everything. Heavy timber beams angled sharply downward until they nearly touched the earth itself. People started inventing names for it immediately. Snow shed, ground roof cabin, the buried house. Children called it the turtle cabin. Elias ignored every one of them. Because he wasn't building for summer. He was building for wind. Years earlier, farther north, he had seen old storm shelters built with long, descending roof lines that nearly reached the ground. The shape forced wind upward and over instead of allowing it to slam directly into walls. Snow didn't pile against it dangerously. It flowed around it, slid away. The lower profile reduced exposed surface area, while the steep angles transferred weight directly into the ground through massive support beams. Simple, practical, ancient, and apparently hilarious to everyone around him. By early autumn, the structure was complete. The cabin looked strange, even finished. Massive cedar roof panels stretched low over thick log walls reinforced beneath. Snow fencing lined portions of the windward side, while packed earth and stone strengthened the base. Inside, however, the space felt larger than people expected. The steep roof created high vaulted ceilings at the center, while lower outer areas served as storage and sleeping spaces. Warm air circulated naturally through the structure without collecting uselessly in distant corners. Elias noticed it immediately. So did Jonas the first time he stepped inside. He removed his gloves slowly while staring upward. "This feels bigger than it looks." Elias added wood to the stove. "Because half the house sits inside the roof." Jonas looked around carefully. The angled beams created a sheltered feeling inside, unlike normal cabins. Protected, almost hidden. Still, he shook his head. All that work just for a strange roof. Elias smiled faintly. All that work for winter. Jonas laughed again before leaving. Because winter, according to most people, was exactly why the design would fail. They had reasons too. Huge roof means huge snow load. Low sides mean buried doors. More surface area for ice. More problems. People repeated those arguments all through autumn. Elias listened quietly and continued preparing. He reinforced roof joints, installed additional cross bracing, stacked packed earth insulation along the lower edges, then waited. The first heavy snowfall arrived before November ended. By morning the valley transformed completely. Cabins stood surrounded by drifts while smoke rose through pale skies. Elias stepped outside and immediately noticed something interesting. Snow had barely accumulated on his roof. Wind pushed most of it harmlessly down the long, steep angles. Instead of collecting heavily overhead, drifts formed naturally around the lower sides, where they actually added insulation against cold air. The snow itself strengthened the structure. That surprised even him. Neighbors noticed too. Jonas rode by later, squinting toward the cabin. "Looks smaller." Elias smiled. "It is." "What?" "The snow built extra walls." Jonas stared. Packed drifts now rested smoothly along portions of the lower roof edges like natural insulation banks. Cold wind couldn't reach large sections of exposed wall anymore. The cabin settled deeper into protection with each storm. Still, people kept laughing, especially after heavier snow-buried sections near ground level. "Hope you remember where your door is." Man built himself a cave. Winter's doing half his construction. Elias ignored them. Because inside, something else happened. The cabin held warmth unusually well. The lowered profile reduced exposed wall area, while snowbanks insulated large portions naturally. Heat remained trapped beneath the descending roof structure instead of escaping quickly into open air. He burned less wood. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. Then January arrived, and winter stopped being ordinary. Temperatures dropped harder than anyone expected. Snowstorms hit back-to-back for nearly 2 weeks, while northern winds rolled through the valley with increasing violence. Cabins started struggling. Roof beams groaned beneath growing snow weight. Ice forced itself beneath shingles. People climbed ladders daily to shovel dangerous accumulations overhead. Elias watched quietly, because every morning his roof remained mostly clear. Wind curved naturally across the long angles, carrying snow away before weight became dangerous. Mrs. Carter visited one evening after hearing rumors. The moment she stepped inside, she blinked in surprise. "It feels quiet." Elias looked up. She was right. The long roof and packed snowbanks absorbed much of the outside noise. Wind sounded distant rather than violent. The cabin felt wrapped inside winter rather than exposed to it. Mrs. Carter sat near the stove slowly. "Feels like being underground." Elias smiled faintly. "Almost." Word spread. Not about survival. Not yet. About comfort. People started mentioning strange things. Mercer's house stayed warmer. Mercer's roof never needed clearing. Mercer's walls didn't groan during storms. Still, nobody thought much of it. Until the warning arrived. An enormous storm system moved south from the mountains, carrying winds stronger than anything recorded in nearly 40 years. Old men who rarely worried suddenly reinforced roofs. Extra beams. Additional braces. Temporary supports. The valley prepared desperately. Jonas visited Elias one final time before the storm arrived. He stared at the long roof disappearing almost into the snow. "You really think this thing handles what's coming?" Elias looked toward the dark clouds building beyond the ridge, then back toward the sloping roof surrounding half his home. "I think," he said quietly, "the wind won't know where to grab it." That night, the storm arrived. The wind struck first. Not snow. Wind. It rolled down from the mountains with a sound people later compared to freight trains crossing the sky. Cabins across the valley shuddered immediately. Shutters slammed violently against walls. Chimneys groaned. Loose boards disappeared into darkness before midnight even arrived. Inside Elias Mercer's cabin, the first thing he noticed was what didn't happen. Nothing shook. The long roof above him creaked softly once as the gust passed over. Then silence returned. Not complete silence. The storm still existed, but it sounded distant, almost like standing beneath thick blankets while rain fell outside. Elias sat beside the stove listening carefully. The roof shape was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Wind struck the lower slope and climbed upward naturally instead of crashing directly against flat walls. Pressure flowed over the cabin rather than building against it. The storm moved across it, not into it. Outside, winter was trying to grab hold of the valley. It simply couldn't find anything to grab on his house. By morning, conditions had worsened. Snow blasted sideways, so hard visibility disappeared entirely beyond a few yards. Drifts climbed over fences and buried wagons where they stood. Then came the first collapse. The Miller family's barn roof gave way shortly after dawn beneath packed snow. A little before noon, another cabin lost part of its western side after wind tore shingles loose and forced ice beneath the structure. The storm kept growing. Elias fed another log into the stove and looked through the narrow front window. Snow slid steadily down the long roof around him, never gathering heavily, never staying long enough to become dangerous. Instead of resisting the storm, the cabin redirected it. That difference was saving him. Then pounding struck the door. Faint at first, then harder. Elias forced the entrance open against screaming wind. Jonas Hale stumbled inside, carrying his youngest son wrapped beneath heavy blankets. Snow covered both of them almost completely. The moment the door shut behind them, Jonas stopped moving. Warmth settled around him instantly. Not roaring heat. Steady heat. Balanced heat. No icy corners. No freezing drafts. No cracking walls. His son slowly pulled the blankets away from his face. "It's warm." Elias handed Jonas a dry blanket without speaking. Jonas stared upward toward the long timber beams overhead. The roof stretched nearly to the floor on both sides, surrounding them like some enormous protective shell. Outside, wind screamed. Inside, nothing. How? Jonas asked quietly. Elias looked toward the roof. The storm keeps sliding. Jonas frowned. What? The roof gives it nowhere to stop. Before Elias could explain further, another pounding struck outside. Then another. By evening, half a dozen people crowded into the cabin. Mrs. Carter arrived after ice forced its way beneath her roof beams. The Millers came after losing their barn completely. Another family appeared carrying children wrapped in quilts after snow buried their entrance nearly shut. Every person entering reacted exactly the same way. Shock. Because the inside felt calm. Not merely warm. Safe. Children fell asleep beside the stove while adults sat quietly listening to wind howl outside. Several times people looked upward nervously expecting creaks or groans. They never came. Because snow couldn't build dangerous weight on the steep roof. Wind couldn't hammer flat walls. And the lower profile kept much of the structure hidden beneath natural drifting snow that added insulation instead of danger. Mrs. Carter ran one hand across the interior wall late that evening. It feels buried. Elias nodded. Because in some ways it was. Not underground, but protected the same way earth shelters were protected. Winter wrapped around the structure rather than attacking it directly. The storm continued through the second day. Then through the second night. People later said they'd never seen anything like it. Entire drifts moved across open fields like ocean waves. Fence posts disappeared completely beneath snow. Roofs vanished. Some structures simply folded. Others lost walls. Others disappeared beneath drifts so large only chimneys remained visible. But Elias's cabin stayed exactly where it stood. The roof kept shedding snow. The wind kept sliding around it. And every hour the storm itself banked additional snow against the lower sides, strengthening insulation even further. Jonas sat near the stove staring quietly at the walls. You know what bothers me? He muttered eventually. Elias looked over. I spent all autumn laughing at this place. A few tired smiles appeared around the room. Jonas shook his head slowly. And now it's the only building in the valley I trust. No one argued. Because everyone there understood it was true. Outside, winter punished rigid things. Inside, flexibility and shape kept them alive. The storm finally weakened during the third morning. Wind slowed gradually. Snow softened. Then silence returned. People stepped outside carefully one by one. No one spoke immediately, because the valley looked destroyed. Several cabin roofs had collapsed completely. Barns leaned beneath enormous drifts. Broken beams and scattered wood protruded from snowfields like wreckage after a ship sank. But Elias's cabin still stood. Snow curved smoothly around the lower roof edges, while thin smoke rose steadily from the chimney into pale morning light. No damage. Not even loose shingles. Jonas walked slowly around the structure in disbelief. Snow rested along the lower roofline exactly as Elias predicted. Not dangerous. Protective. Like winter itself had built extra shelter around the house. Jonas stopped beside Elias finally. All winter, he said quietly. We thought this roof was the weakest part. Elias looked toward the lawn slopes, descending almost into the snow. Most people think stronger means fighting harder. Jonas looked again at the valley around them. Collapsed cabins, broken roofs, splintered walls, then back toward the strange ground-reaching roof everyone mocked for months. And suddenly he understood. Because the cabin survived for one simple reason. The storm never found anything to break. In the weeks that followed, people visited constantly. Not to laugh anymore. To measure. To ask questions. To understand. Some built smaller versions for sheds. Others redesigned rooflines on rebuilt cabins. And whenever someone asked Jonas Hale what changed his mind, he always looked toward Elias's strange wedge-shaped house beneath the snow, then answered with the same words. The wind never found where to grab it.